19th, which means it's Science Day around here. Each day we take a different focus on how we can pursue the common good, approaching the world with an open-eyed, hopeful, optimistic view, and asking what's going on in the world and how we can be engaged in it. And we take a lens of science on Fridays. So really glad to see you. I'm Doug Padgett in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm bragging about this because 5 days in a row on the podcast, I've been standing up. So at my stand-up desk, and if you're watching on the live stream, whether that's on Facebook or Twitch or Twitter or Periscope or any of the places where you find this, and by the way, we're on all those channels and Instagram, we'd love to know what you're doing, where you're listening in from and watching from. And those of you that are on the podcast, shoot us an email sometime. Would you over at Vote Common Goods website at podcast@votecommongood.com. All right, so it's Friday, which means that we have Paul Wallace with us, our regular co-host on Fridays, the astrophysicist. Hey, Paul.
Hi there.
And you're coming from Georgia. Boy, Georgia's
Atlanta.
been on my mind a lot lately. I mean, from elections to the dark tragedy of this week. To,
that's a dark day for my. It's a dark day for my dear city here. I live it's right up against Atlanta. It's pretty close. It's contiguous really with the city proper, and I am brokenhearted by what happened. And this little secret place in me all this time has been thinking, well, it hasn't happened in Atlanta yet.
Yeah.
I don't know how a city this size has avoided having this happen yet, but that clock ran out this week, and I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it's capturing the nation's attention. If you don't know what we're referring to, there's been a rash of violence against Asian peoples in the United States, and that combined with a certain killer this week in Atlanta who took out his rage and death wish on people that work at massage parlors there in and around the Atlanta area. So yeah, thinking a lot about the people of Georgia and the people of Atlanta. And also you, Paul, you've we were joking before we came on about what do we put in the little title below, because Paul's an astrophysicist, a professor, a clergyman. And if you follow him on social media, he's a birder. This guy.
Yeah, that's mainly what I tweet about.
Yes, get you into birds like nobody's business. I'm not a birder, but now I find myself walking around thinking, what would Paul Wallace see if he were?
You should be,
to be here,
because it makes life so interesting wherever you go, and it never stops. I can look at my window now. I can travel. Saw a bald eagle this week, which in the South down here in Georgia is a little uncommon. If you know where to go, though, you can find them, and they're kind of conspicuous. They sort of tend to stand out. Saw some nice ospreys too, and a couple other new species from my list.
What were they doing, Paul? What were those ospreys doing?
The ospreys were getting busy making fresh ospreys.
Making ospreys.
Yeah.
It's an osprey moment.
Yeah, they were up on top. They were mating up on top of a huge, in the middle of a parking lot, at the top of a huge light post. Their nest is up there, and they were right up there in front of God and everybody, doing the thing. So we'll have some. I'm going to go back in a couple of weeks and watch them and check out and see if there's any new ones.
Yeah, any result from the moment.
Yeah.
Hey, and today we're so pleased to be joined by Jim Stump. Jim is the vice president at BioLogos, and that's what we're going to be talking about today is the efforts and the work that they do over at BioLogos. So Jim, nice to have you with us, and remind the good people where you're coming from.
Very good to be here. Thank you. I am in the land of Goshen, a tiny little town in northern Indiana called Goshen, Indiana.
So tell us a little bit about BioLogos. When you look on the website of BioLogos, which is biologos.org, and in fact, when I first saw the name, I didn't know if it was BioLogos or BioLogos. So I don't know if that's a thing that you all are particular about, but I say logos. Maybe you do as well. It's clearly trying to, ask people to consider that the harmony between science and faith is something they should pursue, and you're there to help them pursue it. I don't know if that's exactly how you would say it, but that's sort of how I read it. And that's an important piece of work. But give us a little more background on what BioLogos is and why you're there and what you do.
Sure. Long story. So interrupt me and stop me or ask follow-up questions anytime you want to. BioLogos. You're correct. That's how we pronounce it. is a term, a portmanteau, I guess, that was created by Francis Collins. So Francis Collins is currently the director of the National Institutes of Health. Formerly, he was the head of the Human Genome Project, which mapped the entire genome, the DNA of humans, was announced in the early 2000s. Right after that, he wrote a book called The Language of God, which, to his surprise, became a bestseller, and lots of people all over the country, all over the world, started reading the account of this world-class scientist who led the mapping of the human genome, but then also talked about his Christian faith and how he came to be a believer. And that led him to try to explain how those two fit together, and particularly in the minds of lots of people back then especially, was what about this thing of evolution, because so much of the really dramatic evidence for evolution comes from genetics now, of which he is one of the world's experts. So he writes this book and starts getting lots and lots of letters, back when there were still such things, letters and emails of people asking follow-up questions, saying, okay, you say this and you say this, but how does this really fit together? What about this? What about this? And was overwhelmed. I mean, thousands and thousands of letters he was getting. And for the first couple of months, he tried to answer them all and then gave up, and assembled a team of people together to go through all these letters, to categorize them, and then to write out answers to the most frequently asked questions and put them on a website. And that website was called BioLogos. The term itself, he introduced in his book, Language of God, and there he used it primarily as a position in the evolution creation debates. Didn't like the term theistic evolution, and thought bios, the Greek word for life, and logos, the Greek word that means a whole bunch of different things, including the second person of the Trinity, but put those together to say life that came through the logos. And so he tried to get that to catch on as a position. It didn't really do that, but it did become this organization, which was founded then and had this website. And then in 2008, 2009, just when it was getting ready to launch publicly, was when President Obama asked Francis to become the director of the National Institutes of Health. And the way he tells the story, there was a scene out of the West Wing where he was sitting in a room surrounded by a whole bunch of lawyers trying to figure out how in the world are we going to have this presidential appointee who has this curious little Christian nonprofit organization, and how are we going to keep them separate? And so this whole big set of rules was developed, so that he had to completely disassociate himself in all legal manners from BioLogos. He's still one of our biggest fans, and we use him any chance we get, but there's a long list of rules he has to follow, like taking a vacation day if he does something for us and we can't pay him anything. And he always has to say, the first thing out of his mouth has to be, I am speaking here as a private citizen, not as a representative of the government, things like that.
And,
so
and
he
that
had
was concern about faith and government entanglement, or
Right.
Yeah.
And so interestingly, through the Obama administration, those rules were adhered to pretty strictly. And then he became one of the only people who was carried over into the Trump administration, continued on in that position. And believe it or not, the rules became a little laxer during those times, and he was able to get away with to get away with a little bit more. He has since now been continued that appointment under Biden, and making him one of the only people who has ever served 3 presidents in a presidential in the same capacity as a presidential appointee.
And the big project that he was trying to get at was that people who are writing to, with BioLogos, not so much with the NIH, but what he did with this effort was really trying to take people's concerns seriously, right? Like that people have been taught, might even say indoctrinated, or only provided one side of the story, which told them that evolution and Christian spirituality or origin narratives sit in conflict with each other. And he was trying to not just answer the questions, but change the conversation. Is that a fair way to think about it? That he was trying to introduce new ways to think?
There's been a big value at BioLogos since its inception on gracious dialogue. So changing the conversation both in terms of the content as well as the tone that so much of the creation evolution wars have been fought in, right? That it's part of the culture war. We've tried very much to turn the temperature down in that. And to try to present this as a faithful position, a legitimate position for Christians to be able to take. And that approach has helped to gain us a seat at the table in lots of places where people who accepted evolution were not welcome for a couple of generations. And so, yeah, we have done our best to show how you can take your faith seriously and take the findings of modern science seriously. And we use the phrase harmony between faith and science, but realize that harmony itself is a concept that isn't just, one dimensional. In harmonies, and at least good music at harmonies, can sometimes have tensions that have to be resolved, and can be multi-layered. And so we recognize all of that these are difficult conversations for lots of people, and it takes thinking about things in a way that many of us were not brought up to think about them. But we just want to show that there is a way to take your faith seriously, to take the findings of modern science seriously, and that those two can coexist.
Jim, can I ask you a question about that real quick? Speaking of this evolution versus creation debate, do you see that as something that's kind of going away? Some of the language you used sort of made me think either before or during the broadcast here that maybe that's not such a hot issue anymore. Maybe that's become secondary. What's your view of that? Is that something that's going away?
If you would look at the comments on our social media feeds, you wouldn't think it's gone. We still get a fair amount of pushback and trolling from people that think it's one of the most important issues that Christians should be involved in. But I do think that culturally it has become a little less important than it was for a while. And particularly younger generations of people are seeing the interaction of science and faith in different topics, things like climate change, even things like racial inequality, the issues where both science and Christian faith ought to have a voice. And that those are some of the conversations that we're finding really fruitful right now. We're not going to get away from talking about evolution. I mean, there are a lot of things wrapped up in that, like biblical interpretation, that are going to remain central and important to many strands of Christianity for sure. But we do think that the conversation can be broader than just how old do you think the Earth is, and did humans have common ancestors with other life?
Hey, and Jim, I know you're not a biologist or a professional only in evolution. So this question might sound a little bit ignorant, because maybe there's a lot of answers that I'm just not aware of. But I feel like from the time I was even a child, like in ninth grade or something, and hearing about human evolution and species evolution, there was this notion that there's things that are missing. Or I think it was called the missing link or something when I was a kid. Has there been much advancement in sort of the notion of evolution, the human species evolution over the last 30, 40 years? I haven't paid a lot of attention to it. Or has evolution and biology sort of moved, as you mentioned, like into other areas of understanding? Because it just seems like there's still this 30 or 40-year-old question that kind of hangs out there for a lot of people who, they certainly, like, I'm all for evolution, but it's just like if somebody has to explain to me, like, so how did that work, and how did the hominids develop, like when and how, and all of a sudden I feel like, I don't know any more than I knew when I was in ninth grade. So has there been much around that?
It has. Okay. So for sure, there are issues when you talk about the fossil record, the bones that we dig up in the ground of creatures that used to live a long time ago. And Darwin himself, in the 19th century, talked about the fossil record and how there were always going to be gaps. It's a very rare thing for something to be fossilized and preserved for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. That being said, the last 40 years of of finding fossils of human ancestors has been remarkable. So if you go down to Washington, D.C., to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, they have a wing there called the Hall of Human Origins that's directed by a guy named Rick Potts, who is a Christian, actually. We've interviewed him on the BioLogos podcast, and he has gone every year. He probably missed the COVID year here, but he's gone every year to Africa digging up fossils. They have a display there that shows the incredible advance in fossil hunting over the last couple of decades, where there are now fossils from more than 6,000 different individuals in the time span between our last common ancestor with chimpanzees to present day Homo sapiens.
Wow.
So does that mean we have this complete, you can connect every dot from every generation? No, of course not. But the number of fossils that have been found, I'm actually right now about 150 pages into a book called The Fossil Men, which is kind of it's detailing some of the history of the last 30 years, but more getting into the personalities of the people who are actually out there digging fossils in Ethiopia and Kenya, and then into South Africa, where the number of fossils turning up has just been incredible, way quicker than we've been able to synthesize and understand what it all means. And unfortunately, the popular sort of reporting on things like that always give you headlines like, oh, everything we knew is wrong, and the whole history of human evolution has been overturned. And well, what's happening is there are so many gaps being filled in so quickly that it causes us to see the whole a little bit differently. It doesn't bring into question at all the fact that we had these ancestors who looked a lot different than we were, and were in many cases intermediate species between us and the last common ancestors we had with chimpanzees and all of that. But our understanding of it has become much more nuanced in the fact, particularly say that there were lots of different human species. Can I use that word? Some people aren't going to like that, but we're classified as Homo sapiens, and there are at least 8 or 9 other species under the genus Homo that have been discovered now. And at least 5 or 6 of those were alive at the same time, walking around the earth, different species of the genus Homo. And this is really remarkable. And we know now that there was intermingling of the sort that Paul was talking about with the ospreys there back in our ancestry with these other species of humans, these other species of hominins, we might say at least. So that has, over the last 30 or 40 years, when I was in college, I heard the standard sort of look at all the gaps in the fossil record, where are the intermediate species. We still get people saying things like, you could put all of the, the human fossils from our ancestors in the back of a hatchback. And, those are just so woefully outdated statements now.
Wow. Well, I'm glad I asked. Thanks. And now next time I go to Washington, D.C., I won't just look for fossils in the Senate. I'll go over to the Smithsonian. But I'm going to literally play a sound effect. No, that's really helpful, because one of the things we talk about here on this episode of our podcast is just how hard it is to keep up with all the science. And science is it's not one thing, it's a whole area of understanding and a way of understanding the world. So sometimes we even use science maybe a little too colloquially, but that idea that there's so much that we know and can know, and people continue to learn and to know and to share, it's really overwhelming in a kind of a information age period that we live in, even with the internet and all. So if someone heard that bit you just said and thought, oh my gosh, I wish they'd talk another 45 minutes about that, I'm guessing that on the Language of God podcast that you host, there would be an episode or two that would go into this.
Yeah, so this episode with Rick Potts was fairly early on. I'm thinking episode 8 or 9, somewhere in there, maybe 12. I think it was the last episode of season 1 of Language of God. Yeah, thanks for asking about that, though. I encourage all your listeners to give that a listen. We try to cover a whole range of topics related to science and faith. Another one of the issues that we have increasingly turned toward is the issue of human identity. What does it mean to be human? And obviously, evolution is an important voice in that, but it's not the only voice. And there's a host of other scientific disciplines, as well as theology and philosophy, that need to be at the table when we talk about what does it mean to be human. Our podcast is just right now putting together a series of about 6 episodes that tackles that question, talking to experts across disciplines. And I think that's going to be really interesting if you're interested in these kinds of topics.
Jim, you mentioned that BioLogos was getting involved in things outside of the creation evolution debate, and you mentioned race. And I'd love to know what y'all are doing on that front. What sort of dig into that for me, if you will.
So we have tried to respect the intentions of our founding, and that we are a science and faith organization. We're not a political organization, but increasingly over the last year and a half, we have seen that there are topics related to science and faith that do come up against the political sphere. So we've amended that a little bit to say we're not going to be partisan in political pronouncements we make, but we do recognize that there are inescapably political implications to many of the topics we're talking about, whether that's climate change or even what it means to be human. The COVID vaccine stuff we've been doing, there are political implications. And of course, for race, there are political implications. But there's also a scientific angle into this. And so another of the podcasts we've done recently is with a man named Joseph Graves, a professor, African-American professor in North Carolina, who's one of the world's foremost experts on the science of race. And what's really fascinating to see is that the biology of race is so misunderstood, in thinking that you can just sort of like pick out a gene and determine race by that, when there is really no way of determining race as we understand it culturally through genetics in that way. The boundaries are different. We so emphasize things like skin color, right? Well, skin color, it turns out, tracks most closely to how far away from the equator are you? Do you come from? And that goes across Africa, into India, into Indonesia, into other countries where our boundaries of race are counted differently in many regards than that. So what we've tried to do is to show that scientifically there's not a basis for race in the way that we have drawn those lines, but that doesn't mean that race isn't a thing, right? So there's a political reality, there's a social reality of race that we do have to grapple with, that does have effects, and is not going to be solved just by science. There are some science and faith organizations that take a position on race that merely say, and they point to a verse in Acts that says we're all of one blood. There's no such thing as race, so just get over it and don't worry about that anymore. To try to take the view of, shouldn't we all just be colorblind and just pretend that there is no such thing? Well, talking to African Americans, and these days to Asians, you get a very different story, right? That this is an ineliminable aspect of their reality. And to think that being white just means that's just the common ground and these other things are deviations from, is so disrespectful to people who come from other cultures, and for whom there is a history, particularly in this country, of their cultures and how their cultures have been treated, and that we cannot ignore that when we attempt to reconcile across races today.
And if there is a common ancestor, it's probably rooted from Africa, as I understand it. Anyway, right? So if there was something normative, which I don't think you would say that it's something normative, but there's commonality. And I just want to add that I listened to this other fabulous podcast. And if you listen to this podcast and all it does is get you to other podcasts, that's a win-win, right? But there's one called Seen on Radio, and they did a whole season called Seeing White. And they really went into helping people understand how the scientific movement of the early 1800s, especially in anthropology through the 19th century, was starting to create categories that still exist of how we categorize race. And that was being done to accomplish something in anthropological development that was going on, and that the inaccuracies were devastating, but they're persistent. So we end up with these categories that was brought to us by science, reinforced by religion, and then utilized to justify white chattel slavery. So cultural issues, religious issues, science issues conspired together, or were happy enough with one another's conclusions that we've all now ended up with a set of categories that our society is based on and structured in, and is a very, as you put it so well, Jim, a lived reality. So it's real, even though its history is quite tainted and didn't need to be there. But having said that, it is here. So is that the kind of stuff that you all are talking about as well? And when you think about evolution, race, history, anthropology, evolution, all this?
One of the things we have attempted to do with race is simply to bring about greater awareness of the diversity that there is within the field of science and religion. It's historically been a pretty white field. I mean, look at the three of us. Here we are. But merely to highlight people of color who have been interested in science and gone on to do higher education in science and teach science. So during February, instead of trying to just do some politically correct thing and wave the flag of African American History Month, what we did instead was just to try to highlight people of color and the work that they were doing, even if we weren't specifically talking about race, but just to show that there's a greater diversity out there than too often gets shown in these kind of conversations.
Well, and that's so important, right? Because there can be an attitude about science in which science is fact-based, and therefore its primary narrative is going to be free from cultural bias. And it's good to be reminded that science is done by scientists, and scientists, as powerful as a way of viewing the world can be, they still approach it with a narrative and with a history and with their own background and limitations on how they see the world. So we're not always free from the biases that haunt so many of our other areas of life and work.
Interesting story about that, just as an illustration. We've talked to a young woman, Lynette Strickland, African-American, just finished her PhD in biology. She's out in the field in Panama looking at beetles, and they had a particularly vexing time trying to identify these two different individual beetles, thinking that these are two completely different species, but somehow they act in ways that seem like they might be the same. Well, Lynette herself comes from mixed ancestry, and she and her sister, the same biological parents, but she and her sister have very different skin tones. And so she grew up all the time thinking that things with very different outward appearances could have a different reality underneath. And it was this insight from her lived experience growing up that she was able to see these two different beetles and recognize them as the same species, where all of her advisors, who were all white men, looked at them and said, these can't be the same thing because they look too differently. But it was her, her experience that was able to give us a better insight into reality than if we had not allowed that perspective to be part of the conversation.
That's a great story. That's a great story.
Jim, the work that you all are doing on COVID is interesting. When I went on the website at biologos.org, it's clearly communicating something about COVID right now, right? Like it is saying, here's 5 reasons why the COVID vaccines are safe. So you all have picked a narrative in this, and the current moment of pandemic, vaccines, human behavior, and isolation seems like it's presenting a fresh view of science, a fresh take on science. but it's striking at a very personal level for people. And what I have noticed, and amongst many friends that I have, some of whom have really surprised me at the level to which they are really unsure about this vaccine and about how to think about it, and how limited the understanding is about how vaccine technology works, which I guess is sort of understandable at one level. But boy, vaccines have been around for a long time, and these are not full-on anti-vaxxers, right? I just want to be really clear. This is not a crowd that's saying like, "Hey, I don't believe science," and they're not all down that route. But many people just feel like they don't really have the tools. That it gets, they feel over their, they feel out of their league, over their head, something, very quickly when this conversation comes up. Is that partly why you've raised this? And do you feel like this is a moment where faith, cultural impact, science have this particular dance that's going to be taking place?
Yeah. So in 2019, we had made a pretty intentional strategic decision to say we're going to broaden the topics that we address. And we had thought that 2020 was going to be a big year of us really addressing creation care, climate change, and seeing that as a really important topic about which science and faith need to have voices at the table. And then COVID happened in early 2020. We saw that this was not going to go away. We saw, particularly because of Francis Collins, our founder, and his position at the National Institutes of Health. He's the boss of Anthony Fauci, and so we saw that this was going to be a pretty important topic for us to be able to put out some reliable, trustworthy resources because of the way that the culture wars got involved and started packaging these ideas, right, along political lines. And we think over the last 5 or 10 years, established some trust within Christian communities because of the way we had gone about talking about science and faith, and the content, we think, of what we had to say. But we had established enough trust that we thought we need to be able to speak about the COVID vaccines, about the disease itself, and then as the vaccines were in development, about this. So we pivoted hard from what we thought we were going to be doing in 2020 to using our network of biologists and geneticists and virologists to get as much trustworthy content out there as we could. And rhetorically, the strategy was to get it from Christians, right? We don't think that only Christian scientists can do good science, but for many people in the church, you got to hear that from them. You have to hear this information from people that you trust somehow. Your comments, Doug, about it being so overwhelming just speaks to the fact that means I have to trust somebody. I can't figure this all out on my own, so I'm going to have to trust somebody. And the way we're wired is that we tend to trust people that share values with us in other areas. So having Francis Collins, just this week, there was an article in the Washington Post that said something about Biden's strategy to get religious people to accept the vaccine. And the headline was Faith, Friends, and Francis. It was using Francis Collins, the position that he's in, but then also his very evident warm Christian heart that comes across every time he talks to somebody, to see this can really be an ambassador to religious people who are otherwise nervous of what they hear from scientists, but to identify something of themselves in these other people and say, okay, here are some people that I can trust. So we've done our best at BioLogos over the last year to leverage that, to bring out Christians who are at work on these things and to show information from those perspectives. Now, another thing that was part of our COVID strategy is we also recognize that it's not just a matter of plopping down scientific information on the table in front of somebody to get them to change their minds. You have to connect with them personally. You have to tell stories. You have to bring those people into their lives. And so it's not just, will you people please just trust the science? It's, let us introduce you to some other people. And will you trust them? Can you see in them the sort of trustworthiness that you need? So even right now, we're right in the middle of trying to push this new video series by a guy named Curtis Chang, that has been developed precisely to try to show the religious impulse that ought to be behind adoption of vaccines, not just a scientific one, but he has a website called christiansandthevaccine.com. And we just did a podcast interview with him that came out. What's today? Friday? It just came out yesterday that we interviewed him along with David French, who's a very conservative political commentator, but has gotten on board with this to say this is super important. Because one of the big findings from a week or two ago from Pew was that white evangelicals, among all the demographics surveyed, were least likely to say that they would definitely or probably get the vaccine when it comes out. And secondly, they were the most likely to say, and we're not going to consider the health of our communities when we make a decision like that. And you're going, seriously? This is Christians saying, I am not going to love my neighbor when I decide whether or not to get a vaccine? And so we've really been trying to push not just the scientific information, but also how this ought to flow out of our deeper commitments as Christians and loving our neighbor, that I'm not getting vaccinated because I'm scared for myself necessarily, but I want to do everything I can to protect those who are more vulnerable in our communities.
Paul, you have a follow up on that at all? Because I've got one. If you don't,
no, you go.
This is kind of for both of you, because you both worked in higher ed and you're both public in trying to advocate for science to a religious community. At least this is my interpretation of both of you. You're not calling for a subset of science that is Christian science. So there's not Christian astrophysicists or Christian birders or Christian evolution. You're people from a faith perspective yourself and trying to communicate to others about this reality. And Paul and I have talked about this a couple of times. Jim, so I'm interested in your feedback as well. Are you feeling like a corner is being turned in science generally in the United States? Do you feel like maybe this moment that we have where people are being asked to believe the scientists is pushing us to a new space? Or is this a moment where we're recognizing, all right, there's still an awful lot to do, and higher education and inside the system of teaching, learning, distributing information is not the key place to be, that we have to sort of get out in the public sphere. So I know that's kind of a complicated area, but sort of take all of that. Do you feel like we're getting any better? Are we getting somewhere? And what's the way forward?
I feel like it's more of the latter. Like we're trying to. I'm shocked by the number of people who, for example, with the vaccine, who just don't want to take it because they don't trust science. I feel like we're not turning a new corner. I feel like we're trying to fix a problem which has developed over the last 10 years or maybe 15 years.
At the beginning
sort of the fracturing of information sources, people get, that has led to a whole lot of, it has increased ignorance, I'm afraid, about a lot of things, especially scientific things.
At the beginning of the pandemic, there were many of us that were questioning, were actively asking, is this going to be the event that really does help turn the corner on this, that's going to bring people together within the church related to science, because we're going to see that science is what we need here to figure out how to get us out of some of this. And by May, June, July, we started going, doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it. So now the optimist in me is saying, will we really see, though, now that the effects that the vaccine can have, will that help to persuade some people? And we just have such deeply seated worldviews and conceptual schemes stuck to us that are combined with so many other parts that it's very difficult to disentangle that in lots of people's minds. Anecdotally, I've been happy with some of the conversations from people that did seem to see that what they had previously not trusted really has been trustworthy. When people actually take the time to see, for instance, what does it take for the FDA to approve one of these vaccines? You know, the process, the independent review that goes on through this, and that it's not just all at the whim of the big pharma companies, the way, you know, some would have you believe that it is. So people that have actually taken the time to walk through some of those to see the vaccine development that has gone on just remarkably have been persuaded. But for so much of our public discourse on this that happens at the level of tweets and Facebook posts, I'm afraid that I'm not overly optimistic that there's going to be a massive change in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I hear a lot from people on this regard is this phrasing that goes something like, no, look, I believe science. I just don't believe the people who use the science, right? It sort of is this next move, right? So sure, I trust the scientists, but then, as you put it, Jim, big pharma kicks in, or the technologists, or whomever else. You know, I just heard this news story the other day that was about the ability to start to create an embryo, maybe in a mouse or something, fully outside of a human being, and the deep ethical questions that go on about this. And even there, the pushback from the scientific ethicists, I think, was, well, it's not that we don't trust these scientists, but someone's going to get their hands on this. And when those people get their hands on it, then the application of it is going to be something different, be that the government or industry or a renegade, some evil villain of some kind. So it's funny that there's like this little dodge that sort of gently happens, right? Where it's like kind of not about the science at all. So I hear people say this like, well, I trust the scientists, I don't trust my governor, or I trust the scientists, I don't trust, Pfizer. I don't know what we do about that. I mean, that's maybe that's just part and parcel, and you have to sort of.
One thing we have to do about it is to emphasize to people that trusting science has its limits too, that we should not cede all of our lives to science as though they can make ethical decisions on our behalf, right? So I want to consistently get the point out that science is really good within the sphere to which it most properly belongs, and that there needs to be other things out of that. So this is to go against, the Richard Dawkins types that thinks that science can answer every question, and if it can't answer a question, then that's not a valid question. I don't hold
really
that
a question.
So I want to say, let science be really good at doing science, and then remember that we still need to have ethicists, and we still need to have philosophers, and we still need to have theologians that come alongside to help answer some of those other questions.
In fact,
the empirical data itself won't solve.
Yeah. In fact, we need them more than ever.
Yeah, given the situations Paul or Doug was just talking about.
Yeah, and it feels like all of this sits in a category of the crisis of expertise, right? On sort of two sides. One, there's some people who just say, like, I don't trust experts. If someone's an expert, then they're too bought in, right? There's that version. But then there's another, and that's inside of all of our parts of our society, where people tend to not want, they approach an expert as if it's some kind of a something I couldn't possibly do. Like, I wash my hands of it, right? Like, that's just not my area. I'm not an expert in that, so I'll leave it to someone else. And it feels like the interlinking of experts, and I know a lot of science efforts are doing this. They're trying to bring artists and musicians and people that do child development and people that do theology all together to start to kind of tackle an idea, because some of this expertisism is either I don't trust experts, or experts saying like, I can't comment on that because that's not my field. And it kind of returns us back to this strata world where people are operating in their own silos, and then it just leaves it up to like some sassy entrepreneur to try to pull all that stuff together. So it feels like our society, global society, needs to find some ways to bring all of these expertise together.
And that's usually the role of a generalist, to bring these multiple strands together. I fully concur with what you're saying, and want to emphasize that expertise itself is a pretty biblical concept rooted in the body, right? The body is a unit. It has lots of different parts. Though all its parts are many, there's still one body, says Paul. And to allow those different parts to do what they're good at, what they're intended to do, is the way we should treat them. And then to your further point, though, of we've got to be able to understand that. We've got to be able to access these insights in a way that connects with my lived reality. Is we need translators. I said generalists, maybe translator is a better
translator
word. So we need translators to be able to say, and that's that's kind of what BioLogos does. I mean, we're not a scientific organization in the sense that there's a laboratory that we do experiments, right? We have those networks of people, but what we're really trying to do is to translate that world to people who otherwise aren't going to read academic journals in, the technical side of the sciences. So.
And that's what I try to do too. I don't have an organization. I've just got myself. I've got one job in a science classroom and one job at a church. And I live in both worlds, and I often find myself doing that very act of translating.
And that translating has to go both directions too, right?
It goes both directions,
from
exactly.
Science to the rest of the world. The scientists need to have the rest of the world translated to them sometimes to understand what the concerns are.
It goes both ways, as all good translators do.
Yeah, and this and the piece that link, a lot of the work I've done has been in theology, ministry, human, engagement in the world, and I have found in just how crucially important art is, and everything we would consider in the arts, creativity, music, dance, visuals. That world seems to operate in a language, to borrow the phrase from Colin's book and from your podcast, The Language of God, that is a language set which often in theology or human development has a hard time translating or people understanding, and certainly in the sciences. And it feels to me like that's a place that in the 21st century, science and faith and art really need each other, probably at a level that is going to be unparalleled. And not just art as illustration, right? Not like, hey, could somebody make an artistic video to show this thing? That's not the role. It's the true partnering role. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts about that, or if you're projecting in that or seeing someone who's doing that work.
I do. I will briefly say that I've often thought that art has a way of making connections and drawing different worlds together that is really lost on philosophy and on science and even on theology. 10 years ago, there was this movie called The Tree of Life, and a lot of people didn't like it. It was, too far out. It was a beautiful movie. It was perfect. And it did a lovely job of exactly bringing together our everyday personal lives and a host of scientific questions having to do with evolution and so forth. And also theology, for that matter. It really brought it all together. And I've always often thought that art can do that in a graceful, seamless way that the more narrow disciplines just can't do.
Yeah. So like it or not, it's become pretty clear from the social psychologists that our views are not changed primarily as a result of rational discourse. but
Exactly.
and so there's an emotional connection that art brings that can be much more effective in connecting to somebody, in showing them a way to live in the world, a way of being that you're not going to get. So that's what I meant when I said you can't just plop the scientific data down on the table in front of somebody and say case closed. So the artists are the ones that make that data incarnate, right? That shows here is what it is to be a person who believes this stuff, rather than just some propositions that are floating around disembodied somehow. We are embodied creatures, and art is what helps to show the embodiment of our ideas.
Yep. Well said. Yeah.
And I know, and Jim, we didn't give your full pedigree. You have worked for a long while in liberal arts education, so obviously you consider that and think about those things. And this is where the struggle comes, just in how we do education in this country, especially for people in the younger years of their education. That when we step away from art and bodily engagement and invest in STEM, without that having an artistic component, it continues this distinction and separation between groups. Paul and I will often joke that rarely does somebody ever say, like, hey, I'm not good at reading, and brag about it, but they'll say that about not being good at math, right? Because somehow the math people can be someone else. Or I'm not good at singing, but you wouldn't say, like, I don't know, I trip a lot and I'm really proud of that. So there's this thing that happens from the youngest of ages. Like, are you into art or are you into science? Are you, and the degrees that we get are either going to be a BS degree or a BA degree, a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts. And like, this thing just permeates our entire society in a way that feels like we need a fresh approach to this, a more broad, cultural, inclusive approach on all kinds of issues: gender, race, age, all manner of things, but also just sort of how someone views the world, and can they see themselves as a scientific person. I bet there are people watching this stream today or listening to this podcast because they say, oh, I really like the Science Day. And other people, they won't hear this, so it won't hurt their feelings, are not watching or listening because they're like, oh, it's science. Science isn't really my thing, right? And that feels like it's one of the great horizons that we have to run toward, is to try to make that base distinction that feels like it runs from childhood all the way through a college degree, making these separations.
It's way too late in the podcast to get me started on K through 12 education. It really is. The students I get are, I don't know, college students, that they're so afraid of being wrong that they don't take risks. And I swear, I actually tweeted about this last night, that it is connected in some way to those infernal standardized tests they've got to take. And I think this does connect with what you're saying, because you talked earlier about the artistic embodied sense of who we are, and all these tests it becomes just it becomes a head game. It's all about the head. It's not about the body. It's not about who we are as people. It's not about connecting across subjects and humanizing science or any other subject. It's just about this sort of head knowledge. But I don't want to get off too far onto another set of rails here.
We will pick that up in one of our Friday discussions, though. Let's hear the full rant on that at some point.
Yeah.
Jim, any work that you all are doing in that area, or that you see something sort of developing in some way or the other?
We have historically had connections with different artists, for sure. We are just in the midst of producing a biology curriculum that's not it's not its own textbook, but it's a supplement for high schoolers that draws much more holistically on some of these things you're talking about, instead of just the scientific data. So again, being able to understand science from a bigger perspective where we recognize that these are people. And so being able to profile different scientists is part of that as individuals, and understanding the implications of being able to draw on movies, as Paul said earlier, to illustrate different things. I think those are all good, legitimate ways of drawing science into conversation with other disciplines.
Well, it's great. Thank you, Jim, for being with us today. Thanks to your work at BioLogos. We know that a lot of the people that we're trying to connect with in our work, where we do take we want people to look at their politics just as seriously as they look at everything else around here. We want them to take seriously their civic engagement. As we like to joke, we want you to care about politics, not because you love politics, but because you love your neighbor. And it's a way that we live with each other, in a way that we engage in our collective life with one another. And and we know a lot of people have an identity, a faith identity, and that identity is framed by a lot of factors that they didn't choose. It kind of that's the way identities work. It comes with the package. And now they're trying to remake their identity. And one of these places is the role that science, and especially origin stories. So I think the evolution work that you all do is so important. It seems to me it's about origin stories and authority. To whom will we trust, and from whom did we come? That really becomes a battleground for people. So the work that you're doing at BioLogos, we're super excited about, and appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Thanks. My pleasure to be here.
Paul, good to see you, my friend. What should we look for if in the birding world here in the spring? It seems like
it's coming, baby. Spring migration is it's starting. I'm hearing new bird songs. I've seen the first few summer residents show up around here down in Georgia, but there's a wave coming up from the south, up to the north, and
the big bird migration.
It's spectacular. I can't wait. It peaks around here in late April, maybe 1st of May.
Well, I hope people follow you on Twitter. I've forgotten your Twitter handle off the top of my
Paul
head.
M. Wall at Paul M. Wall.
Paul M. Wall.
Paul M. Wall.
If you want
M,
to,
M as in Matthew. Yeah, my middle name.
If you want to have somebody that's going to walk you through loving birds, Paul M. Wall on Twitter. Jim, thanks. Are you a tweeter as well, not in the bird sense, but in the social media sense?
I do have a Twitter account that I hardly ever use. BioLogos is the one to follow if you're looking for this kind of content to come through social media. So BioLogos and the Language of God podcast are my two primary ways of getting things out to the world.
Well, again, thanks for being with us today. All of you, thanks for being a part of the podcast. Let us know that you enjoyed. If you listen only on the podcast, send us an email over podcast to Vote Common Good. And if you're not on our email list, head over to Vote Common Good and get our email list so we can keep up with you. We do a lot of things. In fact, we're going to be launching a April 4-week session on the threat of Christian nationalism, a webinar, 4-week long webinar, 4 Tuesday nights for faith leaders, pastors, individuals who realize that their communities have been caught up in a narrative that's going to be very damaging. So you'll get a lot of information about that coming out in the next couple of days. And hope you have a great weekend all. And if you're just a constant follower of the podcast and live stream, we will see you on Monday. So thanks for being with us.